Good day, everybody. I hope today finds everybody well, safe from the job and in the hospitals and all that. It's Chris Bacon, the brain injured guy here. We're going to do another public service announcement or educational thing. This is, excuse me, I'm going to be reading. It's called IPUHB.PDF, which is actually the Handbook for Parliamentarians, which I've been talking about. It says number 14-2007. So I will try and endeavor to go through this reading to whoever needs to utilize it if you want to find out what they're supposed to be doing. This is what the UN came up with. Based on the Committee for the Rights of the Disabled, which is what came up with the UN Protocol on Disability Rights and Optional Protocol on Disability Rights, which I was talking about. Yeah, I got my big cup with me again. Sorry. Anyway, I'm going to try and keep this down to an hour per tape now. I don't think there's much more than that. Who wants to listen to me for a couple hours, eh? Anyway, let me see if I can adjust this just a little bit. Okay, that might be a little better. Get some more light up here. Okay. So this is actually, it says it's a 163-page document, so I'm going to stick to the facts and just read it out. Again, this is good for any parliamentarian, judge, anybody else who's interested in human rights, even just general public, to know what's going on. And this is the standard, I guess, because it's not actually law. It's been saying that the promise is in law. There's no actual mechanism or anything to make them do this. So it's more of that. It looks good on paper, doesn't it? You know, it's the practical aspect. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, so we'll start to read this. It's actually for From Exclusion to Equality, Realizing the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Handbook for Parliamentarians on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its Optional Protocol. It's published by United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Interparliamentary Union. They have three symbols for them. Very colorful. Copyright is United Nations, Geneva, 2007. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopying, recording, or otherwise, without the prior permission of the United Nations. Well, again, I'm doing this for educational purposes. Public service announcement in order to educate the public as to exactly what this document entails. So I guess UN publications, if you have a problem with it, please send me a letter. Cease and desist, I guess. So again, I'm not doing any commercial gain from this at all either. It's just to inform the public, and again, for those that may not be able to read properly, but may understand the language, at least this way it gives them a chance to communicate. Plus, isn't that the whole point of the UN, is to communicate what they're about and stuff too? Sorry. Anyway, the handbook is not for commercial sale. It is distributed on condition that it neither be lent nor otherwise distributed, including by commercial means, without the prior permission of the publishers in any form other than the original, and on the condition that the next publisher meets the same requirements. Again, I'll be reading in its entirety, from cover to cover kind of thing. So I'll let you know again if there's anyway. I'll be doing it from cover to cover. Other words, I'll try not to put any of my own into it. Anyway, applications for the right to reproduce this work or parts thereof are welcome and should be sent to the United Nations. Member states and governmental institutions may translate and reproduce this work without permission, but are requested to inform the United Nations. Publication is ISBN 978-92-9142-347-7. HR/PUB/07/6. I don't know what that's for. We're into acknowledgments now. This handbook was jointly prepared by the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, and the Interparliamentary Union, IPU. Principal authors are Andrew Burns, University of New South Wales, Australia. Alex Conte, or Conte, or Cont, I'm not sure, C-O-N-T-E. Oh, sorry, Andrew Burns, B-Y-R-N-E-S. Alex Cont, or Conte, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, but it's C-O-N-T-E. He's from University of Southampton, United Kingdom. Jean-Pierre Gonot, I hope I pronounced that wrong, G-O-N-N-O-T, U-N-D-E-S-A. Linda Larson, L-A-R-S-S-O-N, U-N-D-E-S-A. Thomas Schindelmar, or Mayer, I hope I got that right. The spelling is S-C-H-I-N-D-L-M-A-Y-R. He's from UNDESA. Nicola Shepard, S-H-E-P-H-E-R-D, UNDESA. Simon Walker, W-A-L-K-E-R, O-H-C-H-R. And Adriana Zaraluqui, I hope I got that right, Z-A-R-R-A-L-U-Q-U-I, who is also from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights from the UN, or OHCHR. Other contributors: Graham Edwards, Member of Parliament, Australia, EDWARDS, Anda Philip, F-I-L-I-P, IPU, Anders B. Johnson, or J-O-H-N-S-S-O-N, IPU, Axel Leblois, L-E-B-L-O-I-S, Global Initiative for Inclusive ICTs, Janet Lord, L-O-R-D, Blue Law LLP, Alessandro Mater, M-O-T-T-E-R, IPU, James Mwanda, former Member of Parliament, Uganda, M-W-A-N-D-H-A, Cal Nordquist, former Member of Parliament, Sweden, N-O-R-D-Q-U-I-S-T, Mona Pear, P-A-R-E, Carleton University, Canada, and Hendrietta Bogopan-Zulu, Member of Parliament, South Africa, last name B-O-G-O-P-A-N-E hyphen capital Z-U-L-U. In addition, Inclusion International, the International Labour Organization, ILO, and the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP, and the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, the World Bank and the World Health Organization, WHO, provided initial guidance and comments on the text. Editorial consultant was Marilyn Achiron, A-C-H-I-R-O-N, and again, I hope I pronounced it correctly. Design and layout, Cal Honey, Eye-to-Eye Design in Brampton, Canada. Wow, congratulations, Canadians did this. This is good. We do good work. We're good people. We're precise. Printing, SRO Kundig in Geneva, Switzerland. On to the next page, looks like 6 of 163. So it's called From Exclusion to Equality, Realizing the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, I believe is the title of the document. Keeps having it at the bottom of each page. So forward. Persons with disabilities remain amongst the most marginalized in every society. While the international human rights framework has changed lives everywhere, persons with disabilities have not reaped the same benefits. Regardless of a country's human rights or economic situation, they are generally the last in line to have their human rights respected. Being denied the opportunities that would enable them to be self-sufficient, most persons with disabilities resort to the kindness or charity of others. In recent years, there was a growing realization throughout the world that continuing to deny 650 million individuals their human rights was no longer acceptable. It was time to act. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is the response of the international community to the long history of discrimination, exclusion, and dehumanization of persons with disabilities. It is historic and groundbreaking in many ways, being the fastest negotiated human rights treaty ever and the first of the 21st century. The Convention is the result of 3 years of negotiations involving civil society, governments, national human rights institutions, and international organizations. After adopting the Convention in the United Nations General Assembly in December 2006, a record number of countries demonstrated their commitment to respecting the rights of persons with disabilities by signing the Convention and optional protocol when they opened for signature in March 2007, of which Canada was also a signatory. The Convention ensures that the world's largest minority enjoys the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. It covers the many areas where persons with disabilities have been discriminated against, including access to justice, participation in political and public life, education, employment, freedom from torture, exploitation, and violence, as well as freedom of movement under the optional protocol. Individuals of states parties to the protocol who allege violations of their rights and who have exhausted national remedies can seek redress from an independent international body. The Convention is long overdue. It is over 25 years since the 1981 International Year of the Disabled Persons brought global attention to the issues affecting persons with disabilities. In the intervening years, many societies have moved away from considering persons with disabilities as objects of charity and pity by acknowledging that society itself is disabling. The Convention embodies this attitudinal change and is a major step towards altering the perception of disability and ensuring that societies recognize that all people must have the opportunity to reach their full potential. This handbook is the outcome of cooperation between the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Interparliamentary Union. The preparation of the handbook benefited from an editorial review board consisting of parliamentarians, academics, and practitioners, many of whom are persons with disabilities. Parliaments and parliamentarians have a key role to play in promoting and protecting human rights. This handbook aims to assist parliamentarians and others in efforts to realize the Convention so that persons with disabilities can achieve the transition from exclusion to equality. The handbook seeks to raise awareness of the Convention and its provisions, promote an appreciation of disability concerns, and assist parliaments in understanding the mechanisms and frameworks needed to translate the Convention into practice. By providing examples and insights, it is hoped that the handbook will serve as a useful tool for parliamentarians to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities all over the world. It is then signed by Shah Zukang, which is S-H-A-Z-U-K-A-N-G, identified as Under Secretary General, Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Louise Arbour, L-O-U-I-S-E-A-R-B-O-U-R, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Anders B. Johnson, A-N-D-E-R-S-B, as in Bertram, and J-O-H-N-S-S-O-N, Secretary General, Interparliamentary Union. Gee, I actually got that right. Interparliamentary Union. Thank you. Now we are on we just finished at page 8 of 163. We're going on to page 9. That's the contents, table of contents. So it says acknowledgements is Roman numeral 1. Forward is Roman numeral 3. Chapter 1 overview. Realizing the rights of persons with compelling reasons. Starts on page 1. The focus of the Convention, page 2. Why a Convention was needed, page 4. Rights specified in the Convention, page 5. The relationship between disability and development, page 7. Chapter 2, the Convention in detail. Historical developments leading to a new convention, starts on page 9. The Convention at a glance. The purpose of the Convention starts on page 12. The scope of the Convention is also on page 12, and defining disability is also on page 12. Under the rights and principles enumerated in the Convention, general principles is page 14, rights is page 15, and international cooperation starts on page 18. Under obligations of states parties under the Convention, that's on page 18. Obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill is on page 20. Comparing the Convention to other human rights treaties is also on page 20. Chapter 3. Monitoring the Convention and the Optional Protocol. Monitoring mechanisms in the Convention starts on page 25. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities starts on page 26. Periodic reporting is also on 26. The purpose of periodic reporting is on 28. Follow-up to periodic reporting is on 29. The Conference of States Parties is on page 30. Other mechanisms to monitor the rights of persons with disabilities starts on page 31. Optional protocol under the optional protocol to the Convention, also on page 31. The individual communications procedure is also on page 31. The inquiry procedure is on page 33. Becoming a part of the optional protocol starts on page 36. Under the United Nations Secretariat that supports the Convention starts page 37. Chapter 4, Becoming a Party to the Convention and Optional Protocol, starts on page 39. Joining the Convention, also page 39. Signing the Treaty, 39. What it means to sign the treaty, page 40. Expressing consent to be bound, page 40. The ratification process, page 41. Ratification by regional integration organizations, page 41. Accession, page 41. The instrument of ratification, formal confirmation or accession, page 42. The role of Parliament in the ratification process starts on page 43. When the Convention and Optional Protocol enter into force, page 43. Under the reservations to the Convention and Optional Protocol, that starts on page 45. There's modifying and withdrawing reservations. Withdrawing reservations, page 46. Under declarations to the Convention and Optional Protocol, also on page 46, there is types of declarations to the Convention and Optional Protocol, page 46. Making declarations to the Convention, page 47. Relevance of the Convention to non-parties, page 48. Chapter 5 is national legislation in the Convention, also starting on page 51. Under incorporating the Convention into domestic law, also page 51, there is the headings, the meaning of signing and ratifying, page 51. Incorporation through constitutional, legislative, and regulatory measures, page 54. Types of equality and non-discrimination legislation, page 56. Under the heading, the content of legislative measures, page 58. There is critical elements, page 58. Linking implementing legislation to the Convention, page 58. Types of disability to be addressed in legislation, page 59. Reasonable accommodation as a cornerstone of legislation, page 60. Special measures, page 66. Discrimination by state authorities, private persons, and corporations, page 68. Specific areas for legislative reform, page 68. Intellectual property laws and ensuring access to books, films, and other media, page 70. Legislation recognizing national sign languages, page 71. Complaints procedures under national law, page 71. Under the heading Procedural Measures to Promote Implementation, also on page 71. The heading Undertake a Comprehensive Review, also on page 71. Ensure that all laws are consistent with the Convention, page 73. Engage persons with disabilities in the legislative process, starting on page 74. Involve provincial or state level parliaments, starting on page 75. Chapter 6, From Provisions to Practice, Implementing the Convention, begins on page 77. Under Habilitation and Rehabilitation, that starts page 77. Under Accessibility, page 79. Under Education, page 81. The cost of inclusive education starts on 84. Under Work and Employment is 85. Legal capacity and supported decision-making begins on page 89. Chapter 7, Creating National Institutions to Implement and Monitor the Convention, begins on page 93. Focal Points is 94. Coordination Mechanisms is 94. Under National Human Rights Institutions, beginning on page 96, the headings, The Relationship Between the Convention and National Human Rights Institutions, also on 96. Types of National Human Rights Institutions, also on 96. The Paris Principles are on 97. Potential Functions of a National Human Rights Institution are on 98. National Human Rights Institutions and Complaint Mechanisms are on 101. And Establishing an Appropriate Institution is on 104. Under Parliamentary Oversight, beginning on 105. The heading Parliamentary Committees, 105. Commissions of Inquiry, 105. Direct Questioning of Ministers, 105. Scrutiny of Executive Appointments, 106. Oversight over non-governmental public agencies, 107. Budgetary Scrutiny and Financial Control, 107. Under the Courts and the Role of the Judiciary, also on 107, there is Judicial Protection of Rights, beginning on page 108. References are listed as 113. Annex 1, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, begins on 115. Annex 2, Optional Protocol to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, begins on 145. And about the publishers states that it's inside the back cover. So that brings us to the end of Roman numeral 8, looks like, from exclusion to equality, realizing the rights of persons with disabilities. And we are about to start Chapter 1. Chapter 1, Overview. Realizing the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Compelling Reasons. That's the title. Over 650 million persons around the world live with disabilities. Add to that their extended families, and a staggering 2 billion people daily live with disabilities. In every region in the world, in every country in the world, persons with disabilities often live on the margins of society, deprived from some of life's fundamental experiences. They have little hope of going to school, getting a job, having their own home, creating a family and raising their children, enjoying a social life, or voting. For the vast majority of the world's persons with disabilities, shops, public facilities, and transport, and even information are largely out of reach. Persons with disabilities make up the world's largest and most disadvantaged minority. The numbers are damning. An estimated 20% of the world's poorest persons are those with disabilities. 98% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school. An estimated 30% of the world's street children live with disabilities. And the literacy rate for adults with disabilities is as low as 3%, and in some countries down to 1% for women with disabilities. While poor people are significantly more likely to acquire disabilities during their lifetimes, disability can result in poverty too, since disabled persons often face discrimination and marginalization. Disability is associated with illiteracy, poor nutrition, lack of access to clean water, low rates of immunization against diseases, and unhealthy and dangerous working conditions. As the world's population grows, so does the number of persons with disabilities. In developing countries, poor medical conditions during pregnancy and at birth, the prevalence of infectious diseases, natural disasters, armed conflict, landmines, and small arms proliferation cause injuries, impairment, and lasting trauma on a large scale. Traffic accidents alone result in millions of injuries and disabilities each year among young people. In developed countries, those born after Second World War are living longer, which means that many of them will eventually live with a disability later in life. The fact that persons with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty is often the result of ignorance and neglect that is reinforced in government and development policies and programs that ignore, exclude, are not accessible to, or do not support the rights of persons with disabilities to be included in the socio-economic life of the country. However, in the few developed and developing countries that have passed comprehensive legislation aimed at promoting and protecting the basic rights of persons with disabilities, those individuals live fulfilling and independent lives as students, workers, family members, and citizens. They are able to do so because society has removed the physical and cultural barriers that had previously hindered their full participation in society. It is with these advances in mind that the international community united to reaffirm the dignity and worth of every person with a disability and to provide states with an effective legal tool to end the injustice, discrimination, and violation of rights that confront most persons with disabilities. That tool is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The focus of the Convention. The term persons with disabilities applies to all persons who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments that, in the face of various negative attitudes or physical obstacles, may prevent those persons from participating fully in society. However, this is not an exhaustive definition of those who may claim protection under the Convention, nor does this definition exclude broader categories of persons with disabilities found in national law, including persons with short-term disabilities or persons who had disabilities in the past. So there's also side notes and stuff here. So what I got to do is, I think that's at the end of page 2. I read out the rest of the paragraph that went on to page 3. So there's some quotes here. Let me go back to page. This is page 2, I believe. Yes, page 2. There's a big quote here. In our communities, disability is seen as a charity issue. You are not seen as a person who can have a life, get a job, live independently. This is very much against our human rights. There is a huge need for awareness work in our countries. That was stated by Maria Veronica Reina, researcher with mobility impairment from Argentina. And her name is spelled Maria Veronica, and Reina is Reina. And again, I hope I said that properly. Sorry. Then at the top of page 3, there's a box which says, consider the statistics, and then some bullet points. Approximately 10% of the world's population lives with a disability, the world's largest minority. This number is increasing because of population growth, medical advances, and the aging process. That's from World Health Organization. It is estimated that 20% of the world's poorest people have a disability and tend to be regarded in their own communities as the most disadvantaged. That's from the World Bank. Disability rates are significantly higher among groups with lower educational attainment in the countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation, or OECD, and Development. On average, 19% of less educated people have disabilities compared to 11% among better educated people. That's from the OECD. Mortality for children with disabilities may be as high as 80% in countries where under 5 mortality as a whole has fallen to below 20%. In some cases, it seems as if disabled people are being weeded out. Department for International Development, United Kingdom. That's alarming, eh? Anyway, there's another quote here. For people born with a disability, as I was, often the family expects very little of them. Number 1, so expectations are low. Number 2, physical barriers in the community may prevent them from accessing their community. And number 3, social barriers may prevent them from accessing their community. That was a statement from Linda Mastandrea, Paralympian and disability lawyer, USA. Again, I hope I pronounced it properly. Spelling Linda. Mastandrea is M as in Martin, Astandrea. And we are resuming on page 3 where I left off after the last paragraph. New paragraph. A person with disabilities may be regarded as such in one society or setting, but not in another. In most parts of the world, there are deep and persistent negative stereotypes and prejudices against persons with certain conditions and differences. These attitudes determine who is considered to be a person with a disability, and perpetuate the negative image of persons with disabilities. The language used to refer to persons with disabilities plays a significant role in creating and maintaining negative stereotypes. Terms such as crippled or mentally retarded are clearly derogative. Others, such as wheelchair-bound, emphasize disability rather than the person. Historically, society has often failed to use the terms that persons with disabilities use to define themselves, or has forced people to define themselves using terms with which they are uncomfortable. The drafters of this convention were clear that disability should be seen as the result of the interaction between a person and his or her environment, that disability is not something that resides in the individual as a result of some impairment. This convention recognizes that disability is an evolving concept and that legislation may be adapted to reflect positive changes within society. End of paragraph. There's another box up above, which this is at the top of page 4. Disability resides in society, not in the person, is the heading. A person in a wheelchair might have difficulties being gainfully employed, not because of his or her condition, but because there are environmental barriers such as inaccessible buses or staircases in the workplace that impede his or her access. A child with an intellectual disability might have difficulties in school because teachers' attitudes towards him or her, inappropriate curricula and learning materials, inflexible school boards, and parents who are unable to adapt to students with different learning capacities. In a society where corrective lenses are available for a person with extreme myopia or short-sightedness, this person would not be considered as having a disability. But someone with the same condition in society where corrective lenses were not available would be considered as having a disability, especially if the person were unable to perform the tasks expected of him or her, such as shepherding, sewing, or farming. And that's the end of that box. Still on page 4, new title, Why a Convention Was Needed. Persons with disabilities are still primarily viewed as objects of welfare or medical treatment rather than holders of rights. The decision to add a universal human rights instrument specific to persons with disabilities was born of the fact that, despite being theoretically entitled to all human rights, persons with disabilities are still, in practice, denied those basic rights and fundamental freedoms that most people take for granted. At its core, the Convention ensures that persons with disabilities enjoy the same human rights as everyone else and are able to lead their lives as full citizens who can make valuable contributions to society if given the same opportunities as others. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its optional protocol, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 13th of December 2006, are the latest additions to the body of core international human rights instruments. See Chapter 2. Since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, governments under the auspices of the United Nations have negotiated and agreed upon several international treaties that define the civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights that apply to all human beings. These treaties establish fundamental principles and legal provisions designed to protect and promote those rights. Under the heading Rights Specified in the Convention. The Convention is a complement to existing international human rights treaties. It does not recognize any new human rights of persons with disabilities, but rather clarifies the obligations and legal duties of states to respect and ensure the equal enjoyment of all human rights by all persons with disabilities. The Convention identifies areas where adaptations have to be made so that persons with disabilities can exercise their rights, and areas where the protection of their rights must be reinforced because those rights have been routinely violated. It also establishes universal minimum standards that should apply to everyone and that provide the basis for a coherent framework for action. Under the terms of the Convention, states are obliged to consult with persons with disabilities through their representative organizations when developing and implementing legislation and policies to effectuate the Convention, and on all other policy matters that will affect the lives of persons with disabilities. And at the bottom of page 5, there's another box which goes under the title, Persons with Disabilities are routinely denied these basic rights, and then bullets. Receiving an education, accessing information, moving around freely, obtaining proper health care, living independently in the community, exercising political rights such as voting, getting jobs even when well qualified, and making their own decisions. At the top of page 6, there's another box under the heading, at the United Nations Millennium Summit in September 2000, heads of state and government agreed to work to achieve the following goals. Goal 1. Eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Poverty, and then bullet point, sorry. Poverty as a cause of disability, colon. Well over 50% of disabilities are preventable and directly linked to poverty. This is particularly true for disabilities arising from malnutrition, maternal undernourishment, and infectious diseases. Second bullet point. Disability is a risk factor for poverty, colon. Over 85% of persons with disabilities live in poverty. And that's around the world, including in Canada. Goal 2, achieve universal primary education. An estimated 98% of children with disabilities in the developing world do not attend school. Goal 3, promote gender equality and empower women. Bullet point 1, it is widely recognized that women with disabilities are doubly disadvantaged in society, colon. They are excluded from various activities because of both their gender and their disability. Bullet point 2, women with disabilities are 2 to 3 times more likely to be victims of physical and sexual abuse than women without disabilities. Goal 4, reduce child mortality. 1 bullet point, mortality rates for children with disabilities can be as high as 80% in some countries, even in those countries where mortality rates among children who have no disabilities is below 20%. Goal 5, improve maternal health. First bullet point, approximately 20 million women become disabled each year as a result of complications during pregnancy or childbirth. Bullet point 2, abnormal prenatal events are a major cause of disability in children in the developing world. Such disabilities can often be prevented. Goal 6, combat HIV, AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Bullet point 1, persons with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to HIV, AIDS, but typically lack the necessary services and access to information on prevention and treatment. Bullet point 2, 1 in 10 children has a neurological impairment, including learning disabilities and loss of coordination and epilepsy as a consequence of malaria. Goal 7, ensure environmental sustainability. Bullet point 1, poor environmental quality is a significant cause of ill health and disability. Bullet point 2, trachoma is the main cause of preventable blindness and can be prevented with access to safe water. Goal 8, develop a global partnership for development. Bullet point 1, most persons with disabilities do not have access to new technologies, especially information and communications technology, ICT. The majority of websites are inaccessible and assistive technology is too expensive. That's the end of the box and also page 6. Page 7, starting under the heading, the relationship between disability and development. Once a country ratifies a convention, the obligations established by the convention must be reflected in the state's national legal framework, development planning and budgeting, and in related policies. The convention highlights the concrete, pragmatic steps that states parties should take to support the inclusion of persons with disabilities into all areas of development. See Chapter 5. The convention also recognizes the importance of international development cooperation in supporting national implementation efforts. For the first time, the convention shifts emphasis away from creating specialized programs for persons with disabilities, such as rehabilitation, to requiring that all developmental programs, including those supported through international cooperation, be inclusive and accessible to persons with disabilities. And in all instances, organizations of persons with disabilities should participate in formulating these development programs. Sorry, cat hair. Should try not to. I hope we don't have headphones on. Anyway, that was the end of the chapter, or sorry, that was the end of the paragraph that finishes page 7. But there's another box here. So it says, checklist for parliamentarians, why I should be interested in the rights of persons with disabilities. And they have bullet points. The human rights of persons with disabilities should be promoted for the same reason that human rights are promoted for all other people, because of the inherent and equal dignity and worth of each human being. In most countries, persons with disabilities have difficulty attending school, getting a job, voting, and obtaining health care, including in Canada, the health care part. We could do better. The only way to ensure that persons with disabilities can fully enjoy their human rights is to guarantee those rights under national law, support that legislation through consistent, coordinated, and continued actions across all ministries, and ensure that legal institutions enforce respect for those rights. Marginalizing persons with disabilities and encouraging them to remain dependent is costly, both for their families and for the general public. Empowering persons with disabilities to live independently and contribute to society is socially and economically beneficial. Everyone is likely to experience disability at some point during his or her lifetime because of illness, accident, or aging. Persons with disabilities are voters, taxpayers, and citizens like everyone else. They expect your support and are fully entitled to it. It's the end of page 7. And there's only one more paragraph left for this. We're on page 20 of 163. The need to include persons with disabilities in the world's development mainstream is evident, particularly with regard to Millennium Development Goals. Without their participation, it will be impossible to halve the incidence of poverty and hunger by 2015. As envisioned in Millennium Development Goal 1, see box on page 6. Similarly, the right to free and universal primary education for every child, Millennium Development Goal 2, will not be achieved as long as 98% of children with disabilities in developing countries do not attend school. And that's the end of page 8. Chapter 2, the convention in detail. We're coming up on 42 minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and read chapter 2. I hope it's not a whole bunch of pages. And then we'll break it off for part 2 of this human rights, the Handbook for Parliamentarians. Chapter 2, the Convention in Detail. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is not the first human rights instrument to deal with disability concerns. However, unlike its predecessors, it offers persons with disabilities an unprecedented level of protection. The Convention details the rights that all persons with disabilities should enjoy and the obligations of states and other actors to ensure they are respected. Historical developments leading to a new convention. The United Nations addressed the issue of human rights and disability several times prior to negotiating and adopting this convention. In 1982, the General Assembly adopted the World Programme of Action Concerning Disabled Persons, which promotes the full participation and equality of persons with disabilities in social life and development in all countries, regardless of their level of development. Footnote 1. The General Assembly proclaimed the decade from 1983 to 1992 the United Nations Decade of Disabled Persons and encouraged member states to implement the World Programme of Action Concerning Disabled Persons during that period. Footnote 2. Footnote 1 states, see objectives set out in World Programme of Action adopted by General Assembly Resolution 37-52 on 3rd December 1982. Footnote 2 states General Assembly Resolution 37-53 of 3rd December 1982. Next paragraph. During the first major international review of the implementation of the World Programme of Action Concerning Disabled Persons held in Stockholm in 1987, Participants recommended drafting a convention on the human rights of persons with disabilities. Despite various initiatives, including proposals made by the governments of Italy and Sweden and the Commission for Social Development's Special Rapporteur on Disability, and strong lobbying from civil society, the proposition did not win enough support to lead to the negotiation of a new treaty. In 1991, the General Assembly adopted the Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness and the Improvement of Mental Health Care, known as the MI Principles. The MI Principles established standards and procedural guarantees and provided protection against the most serious human rights abuses that might occur in institutional settings, such as misuse or inappropriate use of physical restraint or involuntary seclusion, sterilization, psychosurgery, and other intrusive and irreversible treatment for mental disability. While innovative at the time, today the value of the MI Principles is disputed. And MI is M as Michael, I as in I. In 1993, the General Assembly adopted the Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, the Standard Rules. The Standard Rules intended to ensure that boys, girls, men, and women with disabilities, as members of their societies, may exercise the same rights and obligations as others, and required states to remove obstacles to equal participation of persons with disabilities in society. The Standard Rules became the principal United Nations instrument guiding state action on human rights and disability, and constituted an important reference in identifying state obligations under existing human rights instruments. Many countries have based their national legislation on the Standard Rules. Although a special rapporteur monitors implementation of the Standard Rules at the national level, the Standard Rules are not legally binding and do not protect the rights of persons with disabilities as comprehensively as does the new convention. It's the end of that paragraph, and it's also the end of page 10. You have to go back because at the beginning of page 10 they had another box there. Key antecedents to the convention is the heading. Under subheading, the International Bill of Rights. First bullet, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Second bullet, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Third bullet, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Under the heading, Other United Nations and ILO instruments dealing specifically with human rights and disability. There is bullet point 1, Declaration on the Rights of Mentally Retarded Persons, 1971. Bullet 2, Declaration on the Rights of Disabled Persons, 1975. Bullet 3, World Program of Action Concerning Disabled Persons, which was 1982. Bullet 4, TALLIN, TALLINN, Guidelines for Action on Human Resources Development in the Field of Disability, was 1990. Bullet point 5 is Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness and the Improvement of Mental Health Care, 1991. And bullet point 6 is Standard Rules on the Equalization of Opportunities for Persons with Disabilities, 1993. That's the end of that box. And the end of page 10. Next paragraph. International human rights instruments promote and protect the rights of everyone, including persons with disabilities. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights together form what is known as the International Bill of Human Rights. These three documents together recognize the civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights that are inalienable to every human being. Thus, the International Bill of Human Rights recognizes and protects the rights of persons with disabilities, even if those persons are not explicitly mentioned. That's the end of page 11, and there's another box here under the heading, The Path to a New Convention. They have the subheading of December 2001. Government of Mexico proposal in the General Assembly to establish an ad hoc committee to consider proposals for a comprehensive and integral international convention to promote and protect the rights and dignity of persons with disabilities. Under the heading of August 2002, first session of the ad hoc committee. in which it discussed this rationale for a possible new convention and procedures for participation of civil society. 25th of August 2006 is the heading. 8th session of the ad hoc committee, in which negotiations on the draft convention and separate optional protocol are finalized and the texts are adopted ad interim, subject to a technical review. 13th of December 2006 is the heading. The United Nations General Assembly adopts by consensus the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its optional protocol. 30th of March 2007 is the next heading. The Convention and optional protocol are open for signing at the United Nations headquarters in New York. And that's the end of that box. And the end of page 11. Page 11. Next chapter. Next paragraph. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the first human rights treaty to explicitly prohibit discrimination against children on the basis of disability. It also recognizes the right of children with disabilities to enjoy a full life and to have access to special care and assistance to achieve this end. Prior to the adoption of the new convention, existing human rights treaties had not comprehensively addressed the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities, and persons with disabilities had underutilized the various protection mechanisms under those treaties. The adoption of the convention and the establishment of new human rights protection and monitoring mechanisms should thus significantly improve the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities. Under the heading, The Convention at a Glance, subheading, The Purpose of the Convention. Article 1 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities states that the purpose of the convention is to, quote, to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity, end quote. Under subheading, The Scope of the Convention. The Convention promotes and protects the human rights of persons with disabilities in economic, social, political, legal, and cultural life. It calls for non-discriminatory treatment and equality in access to justice during institutionalization, while living independently and in the community, in undertaking administrative tasks, in treatment by the courts and by the police, in education and healthcare, in the workplace, in family life, in cultural and sporting activities, and when participating in political and public life. The Convention ensures that all persons with disabilities are recognized before the law. It also prohibits torture, exploitation, violence, and abuse, and protects the life, liberty, and security of persons with disabilities, the freedom of movement and expression, and respect for their privacy. Defining disability. The Convention, under the heading, Defining disability. The Convention does not explicitly define the word disability. Indeed, the preamble to the Convention acknowledges that disability is an evolving concept, subparagraph E. Nor does the Convention define the term persons with disability. However, the treaty does state that the term includes persons who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments that, in the face of various negative attitudes or physical obstacles, may prevent those persons from participating fully in society, which is Article 1. That's the end of page 12. And there's a bullet point at the beginning of this page 13. It's a quote. It says, "We are now enacting a National Disability Act, which is an all-embracing legislation that will serve to give legislative teeth to the protection of persons with disabilities. We are also putting in place a number of programs and initiatives to improve the educational capacities of persons with disabilities, because we believe that if the lives of persons with disabilities are to be transformed in a sustainable way, it has to be done through education. And so we are deeply proud to be the first country to have ratified the convention." That is a quote from Senator Floyd Emerson Morris, Minister of State in the Ministry of Labor and Social Services for Jamaica, man. Senator Floyd Emerson Morris, Floyd Emerson Morris. And continuing the next paragraph. The recognition that disability is an evolving concept acknowledges the fact that society and opinions within society are not static. Consequently, the Convention does not impose a rigid view of disability, but rather assumes a dynamic approach that allows for adaptations over time and within different socioeconomic settings. The Convention's approach to disability also emphasizes the significant impact that attitudinal and environmental barriers in society may have on the enjoyment of human rights of persons with disabilities. In other words, a person in a wheelchair may have difficulties taking public transportation or gaining employment not because of his or her condition, but because there are environmental obstacles such as inaccessible buses or staircases in the workplace that impede his or her access. Similarly, a child with an intellectual disability might have difficulties in school because of teachers' attitudes towards him or her, inflexible school boards, and possibly parents who are unable to adapt to students with different learning capacities. It is thus vital to change those attitudes and environments that make it difficult for persons with disabilities to participate fully in society. The Convention indicates rather than defines who are persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities include those persons with long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments. In other words, the Convention protects at least those individuals. Implicit in this indication is the understanding that states may broaden the range of persons protected to include, for example, persons with short-term disabilities. See at the end of page 13? At the beginning of page 14, there is another box under the heading Non-Discrimination and Equality. A few paragraphs. The principle of non-discrimination is a cornerstone of human rights law and a principle included in all other human rights treaties. Discrimination on the basis of disability is defined in the Convention as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction on the basis of disability which has the purpose or effect of impairing or nullifying the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal basis with others of all human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. It includes all forms of discrimination, including denial of reasonable accommodation." End quote. States must stop discrimination both in law, such as discrimination embodied in legislation, and in practice, for example, when discrimination occurs in the workplace. However, states may still discriminate in favor of persons with disabilities when this is necessary to ensure that persons with and without disabilities have equal opportunities. Reasonable accommodation means carrying out, when necessary, appropriate modifications and adjustments which do not impose a disproportionate or undue burden so that persons with disabilities can enjoy their human rights and fundamental freedoms on an equal basis with others. Article 2. Given this principle, an individual with disabilities can argue that the state, and through the state, other actors, including the private sector, are obliged to take steps to accommodate his or her particular situation as long as those steps do not impose a heavy burden. For example, if an employee has an accident in or outside the workplace that results in a physical disability that requires the employee to use a wheelchair from then on, the employer has a responsibility to provide ramps, wheelchair-accessible toilets, and clear corridors, and to make other adjustments and modifications so that the person can continue working as an active employee. The failure to make such accommodations could prompt the individual employee to bring a claim of discrimination to an appropriate judicial or quasi-judicial body. However, the accommodations that the employer must undertake are not unlimited. They must only be reasonable. Thus, disproportionately expensive reconfigurations of the worksite would not be mandatory, particularly if the enterprise concerned is very small or if its facilities cannot be modified easily. That's the end of the box at the beginning of page 14. The rights and principles enumerated in the Convention is the title. Subtitle, General Principles. The General Principles provide guidance to states and other actors on interpreting and implementing the Convention. The 8 general principles are: respect for the inherent dignity, autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own decisions and independence of persons. Non-discrimination, full and effective participation and inclusion in society. Respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity and humanity. Equality of opportunity. Accessibility. equality between men and women, and respect for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities and for the right of children with disabilities to preserve their identities. Under the heading of rights. While the civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights specified in the Convention apply to all human beings, the Convention focuses on the actions states must take to ensure that persons with disabilities enjoy these rights on an equal basis with others. The Convention also addresses the specific rights of women and children, areas in which the state action is required, such as data collection and raising awareness and international cooperation. The explicit rights set out in the Convention are, and then under bullet points, equality before the law without discrimination, right to life, liberty, and security of the person, equal recognition before the law and legal capacity, freedom from torture, freedom from exploitation, violence, and abuse, right to respect physical and mental integrity, freedom of movement and nationality, right to live in the community, freedom of expression and opinion, respect for privacy, respect for home and the family, right to education, right to health, right to work, right to an adequate standard of living, right to participate in political and public life, right to participate in cultural life. The Convention recognizes that certain people are exposed to discrimination, the Convention recognizes that certain people are exposed to discrimination not only on the basis of disability, but also on the basis of sex, age, ethnicity, and/or other grounds. Thus, the Convention includes 2 articles devoted to specific individuals, women with disabilities and children with disabilities. The Convention sets out specific areas for state action. Establishing a right is not the same thing as ensuring that that right is realized. This is why the Convention obliges states parties to provide the appropriate enabling environment so that persons with disabilities can fully enjoy their rights on an equal basis with others. These provisions relate to, and then there's bullet points, raising awareness so that persons with and without disabilities understand their rights and responsibilities. Accessibility, fundamental to the enjoyment of all rights and to live independently in the community. Situations of risk and humanitarian emergencies, a cause of disability that requires specific action by the state to ensure protection. Access to justice, essential persons with disabilities to claim their rights. Personal mobility, to promote independence for persons with disabilities. Habilitation and rehabilitation for persons with a disability from birth and people who have acquired a disability, respectively, to enable those persons to attain and maintain maximum independence and ability. Final bullet point on that is statistics and data collection as a basis for formulating and implementing policies to promote and protect the rights of persons with disabilities. It's the end of page 17. So where are we going here? Actually, at the end of page 16, there's another box under the heading Participation, a Principle and a Right. A few paragraphs. The principle of participation and inclusion aims to engage persons with disabilities in the wider society and in making decisions that will affect them, encouraging them to be active in their own lives and within the community. Inclusion is a two-way process. Persons who have no disability should be open to the participation of persons with disabilities. The Convention specifically recognizes the right to participation in political life, such as through voting in parliamentary elections, and in cultural life, such as through assisting in cultural, sporting, and other recreational activities. However, the realization of the right to participate sometimes requires specific state actions. For example, a blind person might require voting material in Braille and might also require personal support in the voting booth so that his or her choice is clear. If a voting station does not have ramp access or is too far from home, a person in a wheelchair might be hindered from voting, hence his or her right to participate in political life is obstructed. At the top, page 17, there is also a box which is under the heading Equality Between Men and Women. One paragraph. Women with disabilities might experience discrimination on at least two levels, on the basis of sex and on the basis of disability. The principle of equality between men and women requires states to promote equality between men and women and to combat inequality when implementing the provisions of the Convention. Article 6 of the Convention specifically recognizes that women and girls with disabilities are subject to multiple forms of discrimination, including on the basis of disability, on the basis of sex, and sometimes on other grounds as well. Equality between men and women is not only a guiding principle of the human rights work of the United Nations, it is also a right in and of itself. End of paragraph, end of box. At the bottom of page 17, there's a box under the heading Accessibility. Also one paragraph. The principle of accessibility aims to dismantle the barriers that hinder the enjoyment of rights by persons with disabilities. The issue concerns not just physical access to places, but also access to information technology such as the internet, communication, and economic and social life. The provision of ramps sufficiently large and unblocked corridors and doors, the placement of door handles, the availability of information in Braille and easy-to-read formats, the use of sign interpretation interpreters, and the availability of assistance and support can ensure that a person with a disability has access to a workplace, a place of entertainment, a voting booth, transport, a court of law, etc. Without access to information or the ability to move freely, other rights of persons with disabilities are also restricted. End of page 17. Under international cooperation is the heading. International cooperation is widely recognized as vital for ensuring that persons with disabilities can fully enjoy their human rights. The Convention expressly acknowledges this relationship and obliges states parties to cooperate with other states and or with relevant international and regional organizations and civil society in bullet point 1, building capacity, including through the exchange and sharing of information, experiences, training programs, and best practices. Bullet point 2, research programs and facilitating access to scientific knowledge, and bullet point 3, technical and economic assistance, including facilitating the use of accessible and assistive technologies. By including a separate article on international cooperation, the Convention underlines the need for all such efforts, including international development programs, to be accessible to and inclusive of persons with disabilities. Given that in many countries there is a higher percentage of persons with disabilities living in poverty than living in other sectors of society, a failure to include persons with disabilities in planning and implementing development programs would only exacerbate existing inequalities and discrimination within society. The Convention affirms that not only do states parties have a role to play in fostering international cooperation to promote the rights of persons with disabilities, but civil society, including organizations representing persons with disabilities, and international and regional organizations such as the United Nations specialized agencies, the World Bank, and other development banks, and regional organizations such as the European Commission and the African Union do too. Under the heading Obligations of States Parties under the Convention, as affirmed in Article 4 of the Convention, a government that ratifies the Convention agrees to promote and ensure the full realization of all rights and fundamental freedoms for all persons with disabilities without discrimination of any kind. The box below details the concrete actions that states must take in order to meet this obligation. Each state must take measures to realize economic, social, and cultural rights progressively, using the greatest amount of available resources to do so. This obligation, commonly referred to as a progressive realization, acknowledges that it often takes time to realize many of these rights fully. For example, when social security or healthcare systems must be created or improved. While progressive realization gives states parties, particularly developing countries, some flexibility in achieving the objectives of the Convention, it does not absolve state parties of the responsibility to protect those rights. For example, a state must not forcibly evict a person with a disability, arbitrarily withdraw Social Security protection, or fail to introduce and respect the minimum wage. Unlike economic, social, and cultural rights, civil and political rights are not subject to progressive realization. In other words, states must protect and promote those rights immediately. End of paragraph. It's also on the page 19. At the beginning of page 19, they have another box. It's called Actions to be Taken by States Parties. Bullet points. Adopt legislation and administrative measures to promote the human rights of persons with disabilities. Adopt legislative and other measures to abolish discrimination. Protect and promote the rights of persons with disabilities in all policies and programs. Stop any practice that breaches the rights of persons with disabilities. Ensure that the public sector respects the rights of persons with disabilities. Ensure that the private sector and individuals respect the rights of persons with disabilities. Undertake research and development of accessible goods, services, and technology for persons with disabilities and encourage others to undertake such research. Provide accessible information about assistive technology to persons with disabilities. Promote training on the rights of the Convention to professionals and staff who work with persons with disabilities. Consult with and involve persons with disabilities in developing and implementing legislation and policies and in decision-making processes that concern them. And that's the end of the bullet points from the box. And the end of page 19. Beginning of page 20, there's another quote here. It says, "Personally, as a woman with a disability, just like other women with disabilities from developing countries, we suffer triple discrimination on account of our disability, our gender, and our poverty. So this convention is going to be very helpful in making sure we enjoy our rights the same way other people enjoy their rights." End quote. This was spoken by Venus Iligan, Disabled Peoples International in the Philippines. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Spelling is V as in Victor, ENUS, ILAGAN. Or maybe it's two I's. Could never tell. Anyway, back to the core text. Under the heading, Obligations to Respect, Protect, and Fulfill. Implicit in the Convention are three distinct duties of all states parties, Under obligation to respect, state parties must refrain from interfering with the enjoyment of the rights of persons with disabilities. For example, states must not perform medical experiments on persons with disabilities without their consent or exclude a person from school on the basis of a disability. Under the obligation to protect, states parties must prevent violations of these rights by third parties. For example, states must require private employers to provide just and favorable working conditions for persons with disabilities, including by providing reasonable accommodation. States must be diligent in protecting persons with disabilities from mistreatment or abuse. Under the obligation to fulfill, states parties must take appropriate legislative, administrative, budgetary, judicial, and other action towards the full realization of these rights. See box on previous page. Examples of how these obligations might be practically fulfilled are provided in the box on the next page. Under comparing the Convention to other human rights treaties. The Convention complements the other international human rights treaties. It does not recognize any new human rights for persons with disabilities, but rather clarifies states' obligations to respect and ensure the equal enjoyment of human rights by persons with disabilities. International human rights instruments that were adopted after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights clarified the steps that states must take in order to ensure that these rights are respected in particular situations. There are, for example, treaties that specifically protect children or migrant workers and their families, that prohibit torture, or that protect against discrimination on the basis of sex or race. The new convention focuses on the steps that states must take to ensure that the human rights of persons with disabilities are respected. The box above illustrates how the new convention takes one right that was introduced in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the right to equal protection before the law, and expands and elaborates on it, focusing specifically on persons with disabilities. The right to equal recognition before the law is fundamental, not only as a right in itself, but as a prerequisite to the full enjoyment of other rights, since only with recognition before the law can rights be protected through the courts, the right to a remedy. And an individual will enter into contracts, right to work amongst others, buy and sell property, the right to own property alone as well as in association with others, and marry, the right to marry and found a family. Persons with disabilities have too often been denied the right to equal recognition before the law simply because of the existence of a disability. Some persons with disabilities have not been registered at birth, and some persons with disabilities have had their legal capacity completely and unnecessarily transferred to guardians who have abused the rights of the person. To remedy this situation, the Convention explicitly describes the content of the right and the steps that states must take to ensure that this right is not violated. And that ends the end of page 24 and section 2, or chapter 2, but there were some other bullet marks, other boxes with bullets in it that I had to skip over in order to keep the meat and potatoes of it. So we shall go back and see where we're at. Okay, I think that's it, right? Okay, so we have another box. It's at the page 21 under the heading of the obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill, how they might be translated into action. Under the heading freedom from torture, respect. The state must not subject a person with disability to torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment in a state-run prison. Protect. The state must ensure that privately run prisons or psychiatric institutions do not practice torture and similar practices on persons with disabilities. Fulfill. The state must ensure that prison officers and health professionals are given adequate training and information so that the human rights of persons with disabilities are respected. The right to health. Respect. The authorities must not undertake medical experimentation on a person with disability without his or her free and informed consent. Protect. The government must ensure that private health service providers do not discriminate against or withhold health care from someone on the basis of disability. Fulfill. The government must increase the availability of quality and affordable health care for persons with disabilities. Under freedom of expression. Respect. The state must not withhold information or stop a person with a disability from freely expressing his or her views. Protect. The state must prevent private entities from prohibiting a person with a disability from freely expressing his or her views. Fulfill. The state must facilitate the use of sign languages, plain language, braille, and augmentative and alternative communication in official interactions. Under the heading of a right to education, respect. School authorities must not exclude a student with a disability from education on the basis of disability. Protect. The state must ensure that private schools do not discriminate against a person with a disability in their education programs. Fulfill. The state must ensure that free secondary education is progressively available to all, including persons with disabilities. Under the right to work. Respect. The state must respect the right of persons with disabilities to form trade unions. Protect. The state must ensure that private sector respects the right to work of persons with disabilities. Fulfill. The state must provide vocational training with available resources to persons with disabilities. That's the end of page 21. On the beginning of page 22, there's another new box. It's under the heading Equal Recognition Before the Law, the Elaboration of a Principle. Under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 16, it states, everyone shall have the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 12. 1. States parties reaffirm that persons with disabilities have the right to recognition everywhere as persons before the law. 2. States parties shall recognize that persons with disabilities enjoy legal capacity on an equal basis with others in all aspects of life. 3. States parties shall take appropriate measures to provide to persons with disabilities access to the support they may require in exercising their legal capacity. 4. States parties shall ensure that all measures that relate to the exercise of legal capacity provide for appropriate and effective safeguards to prevent abuse in accordance with international human rights laws. Such safeguards shall ensure that measures relating to the exercise of legal capacity respect the rights, will, and preferences of the person, are free of conflict of interest and undue influence, are proportional and tailored to the person's circumstances, apply for the shortest time possible, and are subject to regular review by a competent, independent, and impartial authority or judicial body. Safeguards shall be proportional to the degree to which the measures affect the person's rights and interests. Number 5. Subject to the provisions of this article, states parties shall take all appropriate and effective measures to ensure the equal right of persons with disabilities to own or inherit property, to control their own financial affairs, and to have equal access to bank loans, mortgages, and other forms of financial credit, and shall ensure that persons with disabilities are not arbitrarily deprived of their property. And that's the end of page 22 in the box there. Then there's another one on page 23. It says, Checklist for Parliamentarians. How can I raise awareness about the Convention's main principles? Raise issues relating to the Convention in Parliament. Review draft legislation to assess conformity with the Convention. Liaise with civil society groups, including organizations representing persons with disabilities and human rights organizations. Discuss the Convention in meetings and visits to local electorates, local schools, and party meetings, etc. Discuss the Convention in speeches to public gatherings, particularly on International Day for Disabled Persons, which is the 3rd of December. Organize meetings with parliamentarians to discuss the Convention. Organize television and radio interviews on the Convention. Write articles on the Convention for newspapers, journals, magazines, and other publications. Request that the Convention is translated into national languages and is widely distributed. Did you hear that, Mr. Trudeau? And the rest of you people in Parliament? Hey, Ms. Wynne? All you judges and everybody, Chief Justice, maybe Chief Medical Officer of Health, medical boards, hospitals, doctors, police, please. Did you read that maybe? I know there's big words in there, but you might be able to understand it. Anyway, and if you can't, hey, I'm reading it to you right now. You can get it now. Anyway, sorry, I don't know. Okay. Request that the Convention is available in accessible formats. Ensure that the Parliament adheres to the Convention with respect to its members and staff with disabilities. Advocate for the establishment of Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights and Disability, which could have a role in monitoring the Convention, and ensure that other parliamentary committees consider issues related to disability. Ensure that every member of Parliament has a copy of the Convention and Optional Protocol. That would be nice. Promote the Convention and Optional Protocol in your political work, especially in your constituency. Hold parliamentary hearings on the rights of persons with disabilities. That's the end of page 23 and the end of chapter 2. And also the end of, 122, that's not too bad. So I think we'll wrap that up for part 1 of the Guide for Parliamentarians on the UN Protocol and Optional Protocol and other international laws it's the UN Guide for Parliamentarians. So if you get a chance, go to the UN website. You can download it yourself. Try and post up what the link is. And other than that, I guess come back for part 2. Hopefully this is finding you well, and I'm going to take a much needed break now. Anyway, we'll be coming back with chapter 3, which will be monitoring the Convention and the Optional Protocol. It's on page 37 of 163, so we're getting there. We're almost almost a quarter of the way through, so that's not too bad. That's only an hour and 23, and I tried not to make too many comments. So hopefully this is going to be of service to people, and we'll be back with part 2. Thank you very much. This is Chris Bacon, the brain injured guy, signing out for now. Hoping everybody's well, you stay safe, and stand up. It's time for everybody to stand up for yourself and for democracy. I mean, the police and the courts and everybody can't do it themselves, and who are they going to take the lead from if they're not doing it? And obviously they're not. So it's time for us to all stand up. At least that's my 2 cents. Oh, gee, pennies aren't allowed anymore, are they? Okay. anyway, we'll talk about that later too. Maybe. Hopefully everybody's well. Well, I hope. Hopefully it'll spread some more hope. We can all hope together, and then hope can lead to change. Thank you. CJ Bacon, Chris Bacon, the brain injured guy, out, in and out for now. In and out most days. Anyway, talk to you soon. Thank you.